Hello everybody, I would like to greet you to the second session of the Security Forum, which is a format developed by the Latvian International Institute for International Affairs and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. It was developed during Corona times, so it is a series of podcasts. This is the second session, the first one with the President. And the second one is on the topic, the US cannot afford to protect the EU. Why does the EU need protection? And we'll discuss this today with two academics, but also practitioners. It is Michael Kimmage from the Catholic University in the US. He has been part of the planning staff. His portfolio was Ukraine and Russia. He's an intellectual and he has just published a book on Ukraine, why all that happened, because his portfolio at the planning staff was Ukraine and Russia. Michael, welcome.
Wonderful to be here, Reinhard.
And we also have, needless to say, both are professors, but we'll just leave the title away. Mr. Piotr Żurawski Grajewski from Łódź University, but he's also a practitioner. He is advising the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the President of Poland. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So, my name is Reinhard Krumm. I'm the head of the FES here in the Baltic countries. I'm your moderator, and we'll talk about 30 to 40 minutes about this subject. I don't want to really go into the subject for a long time. I think those who are listening, you have an idea what NATO is and what the EU is. You have an idea of the tumultuous times we have at the moment. It's not only the Ukraine war, it is also the Middle East, and we could go on. So my first question to our Polish participant, Mr. Żurawski-Grajewski, is why does the EU need protection? Do we need protection? It's maybe slightly provocative, but please, and you know, short, always short replies, no co-presentation. Please.
Well, of course, in this stormy world that we witness today, any zone of stabilization, and the European Union for sure, at least so far, is a zone of stabilization, but is threatened with destabilization due to the destabilizing impulses from the outside. And since the European Union is not, in fact, whatever the declarations are, is not the structure to create the military protection in this hard security dimension. Maybe not that much the union as such, but because the union is in fact the administrative and political and juridical structure, but the member countries need the protection, and the European Union is not able to supply them with one. I mean, the most important factor of stabilization in Europe is the American military and political presence and American prestige, and NATO as the main tool of the credible military deterrence. Of course, we have different threats, different challenges. The one that exists in the east is quite different than the one existing in the south. However, they are connected. I mean, we are all aware of the Russian war in Syria or in Libya or Wagner Group in some African countries. Nevertheless, the challenge in this technical military sense of the world is completely different for the Baltic states or Poland or Romania than for Greece, Italy, France, or Spain as the frontline countries of the immigration crisis, or Germany or Sweden as the countries of destination of the overwhelming majority of the immigrants that want to go to those particular countries. Yeah, so the nature of the challenge is different. The necessity to stabilize so far neighborhood, Mediterranean basin and Africa and Middle East demands different tools than the deterrence or the protection of the eastern frontline countries against Russian threat. But protection is needed for sure, and both directions. Sometimes those challenges are interconnected, which is perfectly well known in the countries like Poland, for example. We are monitoring all the time the Russian activity both in the east and in the south, including the connection with terrorist actions all over the world. Nevertheless, the structure we have to build to cope with this or that kind of problems are simply different. But the European Union as an entity, unfortunately, is not able to provide us with this kind of security. The debate about European security started 30 years ago. I mean, in this European Union dimension, because of course the political cooperation was even earlier, but the outcomes are not very impressive, and there is not good reason to be optimistic for the European autonomous capacity to meet all those challenges. So for sure, stability and welfare of the European countries depends on transatlantic unity and not on separatistic autonomous European projects that are still mainly the topics of the talks and not the action.
I thank you very much. That was clear. And then, Michael, the other question is clear. So the US cannot afford to protect the EU? And why don't we start with that question? Is that true? The US cannot afford it?
I think it's not true. I think that the US can afford its security commitments to Europe, and there are deep and long-term strategic reasons why Europe is so central to US foreign policy and to US strategy. 2 world wars fought in the 20th century that issued from destabilization, war in Europe, and I think it's a core concern of the United States to prevent that from happening again. And there are also enormous cultural and economic ties to Europe that don't depend exactly on conditions of peace, but certainly benefit greatly from conditions of peace. And so the nature of that commitment, I think, is clear cut. And I think that that's why the US has been so supportive of Europe in its hour of need since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But just to put a footnote onto my answer to your question, Reinhard, it's clear if you look at the US Congress, and it's clear if you look at the Republican Party, the American electorate, the American population, that something is shifting. And I think the point is not so much that the US can't afford what it's committed to. The point is that Europe is wealthy to a very great degree, in some respects wealthier than the United States, and yet it pays so much less in aggregate, not Poland, of course, but in aggregate pays so much less for defense than the US does. So I think the issue is not so much affordability, the issue is that disparity between Europe and the US, and that's, of course, become a very, very fraught issue in American domestic politics.
Politics, because if the money goes to defense, it has to come from somewhere. Jake Sullivan, the security advisor of President Biden, just published in Foreign Affairs a very programmatic article, and he said the US, or not only the US, but in general, the world is coming into an era of unprecedented competition. So does that mean that priorities might shift in US foreign policy? I mean, we had the old understanding, the pivot to the east, meaning towards Asia, but it's not as simple, Michael, is it?
No, and you've had multiple administrations going back to the Obama administration, the last 3 administrations, that have promised some kind of pivot to the east, and to a degree that has occurred in some regards. You look at the U.S. relationship to Japan, which has become much more robust over the last couple of years. That reflects a certain pivot to the east, and Australia, I think, would be another part of that puzzle. But Europe remains, in many ways, predominant, a kind of predominant security concern that sort of goes back to the 1940s, if not earlier. And whatever national security advisors or presidents or secretaries of state say about the global picture, it's just not possible to diminish the significance of Europe. But I think that you can sharpen the question, and of course that article appeared, the imprint version of that article appeared before the 7th of October and the current conflict in the Middle East, but that's going to be an enormous strain for the US budget and for the attention span of the Biden administration and for the American system political system more generally. So it may not be a pivot to the east. That's the contrast to a strong security commitment to Europe. It may be the Middle East and conflicts there that put a certain amount of strain on that commitment. Those are certainly the balls that National Security Advisor Sullivan is at this very moment trying to juggle.
Thank you. Mr. Żurawski, Grajewski, Poland just had elections. The result is an interesting one. I think there's an understanding that possibly there will be a change of the guards in Warsaw. If that is the case, and we are, discussing security EU, possibly or always cooperation with the US, but is Poland willing to take more responsibility on these issues? Possibly together with France and with Germany and other countries, because as we all know, the EU is not as united as one would like to have it. What's Poland's role in that?
Well, it depends on the ruling camp. I mean, the predictable new governmental coalition will probably just follow the German line of foreign policy. So we have to expect, in reality, not in declarations, of course, declaration can be different, but in reality, there will be the reduction of military spendings and probably the change of the sources of the countries where the armaments are bought. So that will be probably much more European, French or German than American or South Korean equipment, but generally there will be the reduction in military spendings and the reduction of the efforts to create large army. The government that ruled since 2015 focused on that task, and Poland spent more than 3% of GDP on armaments. That will be probably over. And the rhetorics will be much more focused on the European capacities and European cooperation. While the experience is rather pessimistic in that sense that we will remember the European security and defense identity, then European security and defense policy, then European Defense Union with the rather funny Terviren summit, then or area of the Helsinki headline goals with 60,000 soldiers that should be ready by 2003. Then PESCO, now we have European Security Autonomy and European Security Suzerainty, but the troops at the disposal are still nowhere. Yeah? So in that sense, I'm afraid that the real military capacity will be rather reduced than boosted, and that will be the problem. And because what we really need is to answer to the American question about the effective burden sharing, and we can attract American presence, American interest, and American support only by showing that we treat the challenges and the threats seriously, and we spend our own resources, our own taxpayers' money, and our own citizens' activity on our defense before we ask the allies to help us. And that is now under the question mark. And since Poland is the largest country in the eastern flank of NATO, so that could be the game changer in the entire region. So far, the direction of the evolution of Polish foreign policy was clear: more our own troops and more American presence in the region, and close cooperation with our closest neighbors that are in the same boat, in the same situation. That means the Baltic states and Romania, and as much support for Ukraine as possible. Now we will see, because the new coalition is not homogenic one. There are different accents, different priorities among the particular political parties, and it's premature to guess what will be the future foreign policy, but I don't think that the present political line will be maintained.
Thank you. Michael, I have a question for you which goes directly to a special expertise, meaning Russia and Ukraine. Living in Riga in Latvia, but also, traveling to Warsaw quite a bit, and also Lithuania and Estonia. When these countries talk about the war, it is their war. If you go to Riga and you ask somebody, they will say, this is our war. Germany, not quite, I have to say. But what about the US? How difficult is it for any administration to keep up the support for Ukraine? And I'm taking this example because you could argue that EU security is not entirely linked to Ukraine, but you could argue it's at least partly. So in other words, what would be the argument, Michael, to ensure that the support for Ukraine continues, and how many people in the US would say, yes, this is our war?
So I think that the mood, it's of course a big country, the United States, and has many different regional and ethnic differences on precisely this question, but the sense of existential threat that comes from the war that you mentioned vis-a-vis Poland or the Baltic states, it doesn't exist in the United States. I don't think anybody feels, apart from certain maybe nuclear provocations that the Kremlin has tried to sort of put out there into the news space. I don't think that there's any sense of existential threat in the US. And that, of course, is a political difficulty for those who wish to see continued and strong support for Ukraine. There's one other difficulty in the US, and I'll sort of conclude on a more optimistic note, but the other difficulty is that Ukraine, and this goes back to 2018 and 2019, has become an issue in domestic American politics. And by 2018, 2019, I mean Trump's first impeachment and Ukraine-related issues then that have, sort of returned in the last couple of months. And you see that the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is no great friend of Ukraine, or he's sort of half and half. He's sort of half in, half out in terms of support to Ukraine. And he represents the legislative face of the Republican Party. And I think that's really for domestic political reasons. I don't think there's a strategic argument in his case, but he sees domestic political benefit from distancing himself from the Biden White House. So I think that that's a second difficulty. The first, it's not an existential threat. Second, domestic politics and divisions there. But thirdly, if you look at government support to Ukraine in the United States, which does, sort of matter ultimately, it has been extremely strong from the first day of the invasion to the present moment. And although there may be difficulties with Congress going forward in the next couple of months, I don't think that support is going to waver until the 2024 election. And that, given the short attention span of Americans, the number of other conflicts, domestic political problems, is rather remarkable. So by that benchmark, the degree of support is very, very high. But there are clearly major threats on the horizon, and they're ones that Europe, I think, has to pay very, very close attention to in terms of fracturing attention and perhaps diminishing commitment to Ukraine that may be coming in the next couple of months.
Back to you, Mr. Żurawski, Grajewski. As I said already, Poland, I think everybody in the EU would agree, is one of the major players, or at least should be. And I'm pressing you a little bit on that. We did a survey a couple of years ago. We had a focus group, and those academics who were sitting there were saying Poland is rather being the big fish in the small pond, being with Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and other countries, and not really thriving to be a smaller fish, or, actually the same size as Germany and France. And you mentioned this in your first statement. European autonomy or sovereignty is something you are very critical of, even though it does not mean automatically, or not at all as a matter of fact, either or, meaning being sovereign and not, being together with the US. Don't you see putting this together, understanding that the EU has to be more powerful in understanding defense, and still being together with the US?
Well, theoretically, yes. Practically, not. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be misled by some rhetorics. Of course, everybody's talking about defense, but at least we, the experts, are fully aware of the nature of Petersburg tasks. No one of them is about defense. All of them are about out-of-area operations. The entire idea of European autonomy was born just after the end of the Cold War due to the profound reduction in the threat perception, quite correct at that time, at the beginning of 90s. That was accompanied by the Yugoslavian wars, then by the problems in the Mediterranean basin. Namely, we need troops to stabilize our neighborhood and not to defend our own territory against the massive invasion of a more or less equal enemy as Russia, or before that the Soviet Union used to be. And that is quite another threat, another challenge. And European Union never even came closer to the capacity level that would allow it to fight any major war. Please remember that the so-called low combat intensity operations, like in the post-conflict stabilization task in post-Yugoslavian area, that were the only real kind of tasks fulfilled by European forces. There were some operations in Chad and in Congo, but again, it's not Russia. So you need different capacities to stop Russian mechanized divisions than to discipline tribal militia in Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa. And in that sense, we should be fully aware, for example, without satellite system that supplies the armies with C4ITS, command control communication, targeting surveillance, reconnaissance. And we had, for example, French satellites that till late February 2022 were launched with Russian Roscosmos rockets. The Torrejon Center of the European Union Satellite Center bought Russian satellite photos in order to be independent from the United States. Come on, it's not serious from the Central European point of view. So having in mind Rheinmetall that was being built, the Land Forces Training Center in Mulino Novogrodnizhny in Russia for Russian Army between 2011 and 2014, it's remembered here, right? It's Nord Stream 2, again, it's the symbol of German policy. France and Germany wanted to invite Putin for a European summit in June 2021, when Russian forces were already gathering around Ukrainian borders. I don't think that's the experience that is very attractive for the countries that had a very deep perception of Russian threat, and that perception ceased to be historical. That is a deep change. I mean, you cannot argue anymore that we are not in 40s or 30s of the 20th century. It's not Stalinist system and so on. Well, of course, it's not Stalinist system, but we have witnessed Bucha not 80 years ago, but last March, Irpin and so on. So what we expect if we are occupied, we expect extermination of our elites. They will be simply shot in the back of their heads. It's like Katyn massacre. So from that point of view, we are not talking about interest. We are talking about life and death of our countries. And Russia proved to be the same. Please remember that Poland had the experience of 18 wars that were fought against Russia in our history, and all of them resembled very much, as far as the dimension of the war crimes is concerned, what Russia is doing today in Ukraine. Nothing has been changed. And in that sense, we need credible deterrence, and that credible deterrence must be credible not for us, but for Russian decision makers. And Russia is not afraid of European structures, but is afraid of the American army. It's that simple, simply.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to point this out, since a German is moderating this. Good German-Russian relations are the exception. Maybe there's an understanding because of the 90s that in general Germany had always good relations with Russia. That's actually not the case. Not being proud of a bad relationship with Russia, but just informing also the audience that this is rather something which is not the norm. This was our experience after the unification. Slightly coming to the end. Usually, discussions like this end with the note of, it's terrible. And we have to do something in terms of deterrence and defense. Very clearly, that is the case. Again, Michael, Jack Sullivan also wrote that Washington cannot afford undisciplined approach to use of military force. In general, possibly the US will do this less. My question goes, and this is actually a question for both of you. We hear a lot of deterrence, and this seems to be the clear answer for the challenges we have. But at the same time, at least I would like to try to have this reference to the Hamel report in 1967. This is the heights of the Cold War, and I'm sure you know both the Hamel report. And the idea was to say, okay, we have deterrence, but we also need the second leg, which is, you call it conversations, diplomacy, whatever. Is there anything in your view which could be summarized onto a positive agenda towards, let's say towards the Ukraine war? Is there anything one could get united in and tell, the electorate, we're having this policy, we have a lot of deterrence, but we also have something else? Or is this something else at the moment out of the question? Michael, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think there are two layers to the answer to the question, Reinhard. And one is global, not European, but global. And I think that what we're all witnessing in the Middle East are the enormous costs of what you could describe as the absence of any kind of great power cooperation. You could include the EU here, but you have the United States, the EU, Russia, and China. I don't think it's in the interest of any of these four entities to have a broader war or widespread chaos in the Middle East. And yet there's been a total failure to coordinate and communicate. I'm not saying it would be easy. I don't see the recipe for doing so. There's a lack of trust. There are lots of reasons why there isn't conversation and coordination. That part of it is easy to explain, but we do see the costs of that. And it is notable that the costs are going to be borne, in a sense, by everybody, of this inability to have any kind of structure of dialogue or coordination. Although behind the scenes there may be a bit of, I think, U.S.-Chinese coordination when it comes to the Middle East, but there's certainly nothing with Russia. And for the foreseeable future, I think it's hard to imagine such a structure. But still, it's important to underscore the price paid for not having something like that. I think to answer the second layer, or to address the second layer of the answer to your question, Reinhard, I would just go back to the Cold War. And I don't think that this is great optimism about the current situation, but it's a measured optimism. What you see with the Cold War is that there was a long phase at the beginning of fairly direct confrontation where there were no rules. And it was unclear where things were going to go. Berlin was highly contested. You have the Berlin airlift, various Berlin crises in the 1950s, and then multiple wars throughout the world in the 1950s and early 1960s. But gradually there was a possibility to find rules of engagement. And that was not the same as agreement between the West and the Soviet Union about how to manage affairs or what Europe should look like or what Vietnam should look like or Korea, et cetera, but there were rules of engagement, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that we can be, in retrospect, grateful that there were such rules. And I think that we could look in the future to that, given that, here's another way of optimistically framing the current moment, deterrence in Ukraine has been very effective. The Russians have not really moved apart from Bakhmut over the last 13, 14 months. So in a way, they are being deterred in Ukraine. Given the success of deterrence, you might want to think down the road, when possible, when feasible, about what rules of engagement, some understanding of neutral red lines would look like. And I don't see that as impossible. It may not occur in public. It may not be a very, sort of prominent line of effort for our governments, but it may be something that would pay dividends in private. So I think it's a line of inquiry, a kind of imagined diplomacy that we should keep in our minds and apply at the same time that we meet the requirements of deterrence and containment.
Yeah, I would like to ask you the same questions in Łódź. I'm not even thinking about any major initiative concerning the war in Ukraine, but still down the road, what would be the Polish thought on that? Thinking back to 1967, that was 1 year before the attack on Czechoslovakia, Soviet tanks in Prague. So what is it except deterrence, or is this it, deterrence for the next couple of, I don't know, years, even longer?
Well, I am afraid I need 1 hour and a half to explain all the complications of the topic.
You do this in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I would start with the most important one. When we are talking about the Western countries, that means the European Union and NATO member states, we are all democracies, and we are too frequently misled by the perception of the political reality as the debate between the ruling classes, the experts, the governments, while we have electorates. And they are ready or not to accept this or that kind of burdens. And this or that amount of resources can be spent effectively in a strategic way only when we win the support of our compatriots, of our citizens. And from that point of view, I am in short time a pessimist because, of course, when 1/3 of Germany and half of Berlin was under Russian control, the perception of threat was clear and obvious. Now it is not, and I would even add that the citizens are right. Yeah, Germany are not threatened with Russian invasion. Neither is France or Spain or Italy. But the Baltic states or Poland, yes, we are. It depends on the credibility, even not on reality, but on the image of reality in the Russian decision makers' mind. Please remember that Argentina, Leopoldo Galtieri invaded Falklands when he learned that there is a woman at the top of the British government. He was mistaken, yeah? He was defeated, but he made a war. So in that sense, Russian perception of reality is completely different. And please remember that they are not a democratic country. This is a dictatorship, and the main and the only political goal for them, I mean for Putin and his team, is to survive politically, even at the sacrifices of their own people. So that consideration, what is in our interest, what is in Russian interest, what is Russian interest? It's the interest of Russian nation, of Russian state, or the Siloviks at Kremlin. This is not the same. Yeah, they can spend the lives of their soldiers in unlimited way up to the revolution. Another important issue is that Russian system is hard but fragile. Hard in the sense that it is able for large sacrifices without the public consent, but when it failed rapidly and surprisingly. So the final answer is the only outcome of, from the war in Ukraine is the defeat of Russia and Ukrainian victory. Unless it is achieved, that will be next war, till Russian system is destroyed. If it is not destroyed, it will launch next war, simply. So, however, we are all keen of having bloodless solution. That's an illusion, simply. We can nourish ourselves with that kind of illusion, but Russia must be defeated on the battlefield. I know that it is hard to listen, but unless we do that, we will be attacked again and again. It will be the strategic break, like between the First and the Second Chechen War. But the formula war for peace is completely impossible. That will only allow Russia to rearm, to train new reserves, to wait for the division within the West and to attack again. This cannot be negotiated successfully. It can negotiate, of course, but we will be cheated and then attacked again.
Thank you very much. And that, dear listeners and viewers, was the second session of the Security Dialogue. Thank you very much to Washington and to Łódź. I would like to end with a thought of Richard Holbrooke, one of those US diplomats, controversial, but he has worked together with the Europeans trying to end the Balkan Wars. And he said, which is nothing new, but I think that's the essence. He says, policy is not like a product coming out of the head into the paper, but it's a lot of accidents, misunderstandings, opportunities. And I guess what we just heard is exactly that. Looking forward to the future is always what we'd like to try, but at the end, it's a lot of luck, I would say. But at the end, it depends on us, and you have pointed that out. And we also understand that if we work, the war in Ukraine, this is an endeavor which is a very deep cooperation between the US and the EU. Again, thank you very much for listening, for the discussion, and see you soon from Riga. Thank you very much.